shouldn't see my family, that I had, that I was at risk basically of dying. I sort of made my peace that if I had 18 years to live, it had been a very good 18 years. There was lying, there was no obfuscating, there was no pretending I believed one thing, sort of for political convenience. As a historian, David, I've got to handle this one. How do you judge these people who weren't initiators, who didn't involve themselves in enslavement and yet benefited from it? I was a very fearful person growing up. I was a very anxious person growing up. And I think with anxiety, it never really leaves awe-inspiring moment for me. And really, I think will stay with me.
Wow, how profound.
That's an astonishing question. I thought it was such a vexing question. When we met you, for some reason, our friends having these bottles of Prosecco, which when we saw you, we sort of leapt on you and started spraying them at you. And I think by about the third try, we were absolutely down to you. I think the more empathy, and this is why I'm such a fan of your podcast, but also just of you, of talking to you, David. You have an extraordinary skill for empathy and of asking, well, what brought you here?
Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to my podcast, Coffee's on Me, David Quan, where I strive to give guests legacy-worthy interviews that listeners can enjoy while cooking, commuting, relaxing, or walking their pets. I'm joined today in week 7 of Lent term at Cambridge by a very, very happy man, whose name we've heard plenty of over the past week, and who's even happier than you may expect because of the latte, I hope.
Absolutely, David, absolutely.
We are approaching 10,000 podcast downloads, and if you have been enjoying the discussions on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts, thank you. And please do consider leaving a review and nominating a guest by contacting me via my Linktree, David Quan. For those new to the podcast, welcome, and thank you for your engagement. Please know that I don't take your time and feedback for granted, because when I started this podcast at a low point of my time in Cambridge, I was mostly nervous about humiliating myself, but I went ahead with this passion project based on 3 ideals which still make up the content description for each podcast episode. First, a purpose of giving. Second, learning from others. And third, sharing of stories. I'll be the first to admit my many, many inadequacies, and I'll certainly listen back to laugh at how naive I am. But I genuinely maintain this deep conviction that this passion project, if wholly true to those founding motivations about giving, learning and sharing, is a worthwhile pursuit. Seeing this podcast on people's Spotify Wraps or receiving positive messages about the guests always put a big smile on my face. I cannot thank all the guests enough for their courage and insights. For now, I'm excited to host my guest, Fergus Kirman. Fergus is a third-year student at Christ College, University of Cambridge, studying history. His interests centre on politics, healthcare and community, both in London, where he grew up, and in Cambridge. He is President-elect of the Cambridge Students' Union, having won election at the start of March 2023, which is a couple days ago. He has spent much of his time at Cambridge fighting to improve transparency and accountability, above all in his roles as Treasurer of Christ College Students' Union 2021 to present, or still going, and Chair of Student Council 2022-2023. He was also one of the 2 members of the Legacies of Enslavement at Christ Research Project, which studied and documented Christ College's past connections with enslavement over the summer of 2022. And he's also kindly provided a link for us, which you can see in the content description. Fergus, welcome to my podcast, Coffee's on Me, David Quan.
Thank you very much for having me, David. Yeah.
Firstly, congratulations, still on a high.
Thank you. Yes, I am. I'm really, really, really just absolutely blown away. We got the results, 2 days ago in the evening. Very kind of fraught results event. So yeah, it was really, still getting my head around it.
That's wonderful. I remember when we first met, Easter term of first year, we met in MEM. And do you remember much of our first encounters, actually?
Yes, yeah, no, I remember this. I had some friends at Clare. It was, it was after that lockdown in Britain in early 2021. So I was only sort of, getting back into Cambridge and beginning to meet people at my own college and at yours at Clare. And I have a strong memory of when we met you, for some reason, our friends having these bottles of Prosecco, which when we saw you, we sort of leapt on you and started spraying them at you. And I think by about the third try, we were absolutely down with you in Prosecco, but I can't quite remember why.
Yeah, so I think that was right after exams and also right after my election for Equalities Officer for the Cambridge Union.
Yeah.
So you caught me at a very, very happy time.
Good time, exactly, yes, you did.
I guess as someone who has lost many elections and also won a few. I can kind of really not sympathize, but I can empathize with the highs and lows of finishing a campaign period. So for your future self listening to this, what are the emotions that you're feeling right now? Like, paint the picture, the full picture of what you're feeling. And
Well, that's a difficult question. I mean, I think I can't deny the exhaustion of it, right? Because I've been campaigning since the end of last week, and it's now a week later, so 7 or 8 days of just pure kind of adrenaline campaigning, filming videos, writing sort of copies that go online, meeting students, so many students, putting up flyers, putting up posters, and it was all really, really enjoyable, I have to say, actually, because it was a change from doing work, from writing essays, from reading things, but yeah, really just kind of overwhelming in some ways. I think it has also, I've got to say something, and it really came out for me results, and when I got the fantastic result that we weren't expecting that in that way, really I got sort of a great kind of boost, because it's that wonderful moment when you stand up and say what you believe in, and I felt like our campaign really, really was an opportunity to stand up and just say what I believed, and there was no sort of lying, there was no obfuscating, there was no pretending I believed one thing sort of for political convenience. I really got to stand up and say what I thought, and to have what felt like such a kind of not even really a vindication as much as it was confirmation that so many students had thought the same things that I did and seen the same problems I did, was just a really, really sort of awe-inspiring moment for me. And yeah, really, I think will stay with me.
Oh, absolutely. And again, congratulations on being president of the Student Union, which is a massive endeavour, and it's a full-time role, right?
Yes.
So I would like to delve deeper into your policies and also kind of the logistical runnings of what goes behind the scenes of the campaign.
Yeah,
maybe a bit later, because I think the context of the full person is really, really important.
Yeah.
And one of the first chats that we've had, I remember us kind of talking about some of the health conditions that you have, and is in particular how that had affected your lifestyle during the pandemic. And obviously at the time, I didn't really know that you were going to run for such a big responsibility. But when I look at your kind of manifesto, such as, on tackling health inequality, providing resources, better bursaries and financial support, welfare and workload reform, climate action, when I first saw that manifesto, it really reminded me of the earlier conversations that we have. So why don't we start with your experience of lockdown with COVID in the UK for someone who have had to basically shield during the pandemic?
Yeah, of course. So obviously it takes me back to early 2020 when the pandemic all began and so on. And I was someone who, I've been going to sort of secondary care, so hospitals, for years for a kind of a condition with my eyes. And looking back on it, it was this really sort of peculiar and surreal experience, as lockdown, as COVID was for everyone. But basically, I had doctors tell me in February and March 2020, what was coming, that, we were going to go the same way as then what was happening in Italy with the, really forceful, big lockdown. I got instructions from the government and from the NHS to shield, which, for people who don't know, was in the early stages of the pandemic and actually kind of through the pandemic. Certain people were judged to be at a higher medical risk, basically, of contracting severe COVID and getting very, very ill, or passing away. And they managed to identify this fairly small cohort of people because of, comorbidities and risk factors. And they contacted them directly and said, you're at very severe risk of getting ill or dying. You need to take extra steps. You need to isolate yourself from the people you're living with. You need to be, you can live in this own sort of protective bubble where you can't, interact with people, see people, go out, really. And that was such a big thing, I think, for my 18-year-old mind to properly comprehend, that I was being told by my government that I had to stay inside and that I shouldn't see my family, that I had, that I was at risk, basically, of dying. And that was a really, really formative experience for me because of how long that first lockdown, particularly between March 2020 and then when I came to university in October 2020, lasted.
Without an end in sight, almost.
Yes, yeah, because obviously back then it was very unclear, timescales for things like vaccines and for therapeutics. I really sincerely believed for quite a while that this was probably it. And I sort of made my peace that, if I'd had 18 years to live, it had been a very good 18 years. But yeah, really, sincerely, it was such a kind of bizarre experience, as I think COVID was for everyone, but for me it really, really brought home, so many things about healthcare and how the world could be better in terms of health and health policy and provision.
So, have you graduated your IB at the time?
Well, it was a weird experience, right? So it was the pandemic struck before my cohort had sat our final exams. So I was part of in the end, I didn't actually get to sit the formal final exams. They based on things like coursework. And again, that was a really weird and precarious time because they took quite a while to tell us properly that the exams were cancelled. So we had this limbo of about a month at least early on in 2020 where we thought we might have to do our exams remotely, which now sounds, completely reasonable. In 2020 sounded insane. How on earth would you do a remote exam? How would you handwrite it? So yeah, again, another sort of weird state of limbo for us to be in.
Ultimately, you didn't sit your exams, but a 45 in IB is still a 45 in IB, which is an extraordinary achievement. So I guess what I find fascinating is on the one hand, you're approaching the end of your high school time, and obviously you've done so well in high school, and the world is your oyster, that cliche, and you're heading into university with an offer at Cambridge. But on the other hand, being asked to shield, and this is literally a life and death predicament and situation. How did you balance and reconcile the possibilities and also the misery?
That's a really good question. I think it cuts to the heart, right, of what I was facing in 2020, because you're right, I had this great sort of sense of hope because it's an amazing thing. It's university. I look forward to this.
It's Cambridge
for so long. Exactly. It's unbelievable. And at the same time, like I said, I had been directly and personally convinced that I was on the way out. And it took a lot of expectation kind of adjustment and management. And I think I came to university in 2020, really sincerely going, let's just see how it goes. I couldn't really think about the future. I didn't make plans for the future because I didn't know what was going to happen. I think we all had that quite isolating experience early on in, being in the year that we are, where, you couldn't go inside with other people. You had to stay in like a limited bubble.
I wasn't even on campus,
Yeah, exactly. So, it was a weird experience, I think. And for me, it took a lot of, processing, and it just took a lot of time, really, to get out of that sort of bubble I lived in, and I'd been told I had to live in, and kind of reintegrate with the world, because the fear, I think, of getting severely ill and the fear of dying was really, really big. And it's really hard to sort of express. I'm sitting here as a 21-year-old, telling you, I was scared of dying. But I sincerely thought I was going to die. And that was such a surreal thing. And to look back on, I think, well, of course I wasn't going to die. But,
Well, we often hear motivational speakers kind of talk quite colloquially, like, imagine act in a way like live like if today was your last day, would you still do that? Or what would you want people to write in your eulogy? But for you, do you feel like that unique kind of predicament changed the way you see the world, you see yourself, and how you act on a day-to-day basis?
I think I'd like to believe that it did, because not that long afterwards, as I sort of came round to the fact that the world was beginning to get more back to normal, as I interacted with more people, as I really found myself in a more normal setting, in a more kind of normal world. I guess the thing it really, really left me with, and this sounds so terribly self-serving, right, was a drive to make things better for other people, because I felt like I'd been given an extra however many years. I felt like I'd been given another 10 years, another decade, or whatever.
More gratitude.
Yeah, so it kind of it was that's a very good way of putting it. It was kind of, I felt an overwhelming feeling of gratitude that actually I hadn't come to Cambridge for a last gasp, but and actually I could kind of really go out there and make a difference to other people's lives and to my own life.
The IB obviously encouraged a lot of that community service elements.
Yeah.
So did this kind of whole experience with lockdown and the appreciation for the extra opportunities of life, did it just amplify what was already there?
Yeah, I think so. I think the IB is obviously the International Baccalaureate. Some schools in the UK offer
I
it.
love the IB.
Yeah. You and I both love the IB, but it's an alternative day level, effectively. And I think, it was really good to have that focus in that in that learning program on you're never just your essays, you're never just your problems, you're never just your you're actually being kind of trained up to be a member of the community, a member of the world. And I think in some ways it took that, strange experience of the pandemic, that strange experience of life to really unlock for me that didn't just mean my school, that didn't just mean the people I knew. It meant, that I could be here in Cambridge and do things for people I'll never meet and never know. And yeah, I think the IB was, a really helpful driver towards that.
What kind of ambitions did 17, 18-year-old Fergus have for himself?
I've got to be honest, I didn't. I've long had, I guess, a real aversion to planning for the future, and I don't mean that in a way that I'm disorganized, because I like to think that I really make plans for things. I work out how things are going to run. I do all these things, but I think in terms of what ambitions I had for myself, it was to keep going. It was to get through to the end of school and get to go to university somewhere good that I'd find challenging, and then to work it out when I was there. And then with COVID, I think maybe it's sort of amplified something that was already there to really make me, to stop me thinking that that there was much future there for me to sort of plan, if you see what I mean. So I guess my ambitions were to be happy in life, because that's a very trite thing to say, but I wanted to be happy. I wanted to be challenged academically, I suppose. And I in a sort of silly way, but a way I think is sincere, I wanted to go out and meet people and make friends with people, right? I mean, I think you're such an incredibly friendly person, right? You know that sort of drive to meet someone new and to like learn about them, to learn about their experiences, to make friends with someone is just the best experience in the world.
Yeah, it's absolutely beautiful, and everyone has such a fascinating story. And I think, as I was telling you earlier, it's always so humbling for me to listen to other people and to be reminded of just how much that I don't know. It's interesting that you mentioned like looking forward, but because I've always also seen you as someone who also looks backwards, obviously with history as well.
Yes, yeah, you're quite right, David. I do, yeah.
And I was wondering, like, if you could maybe elaborate a bit more on like the Legacies of Enslavement projects and where that kind of interest had come from.
So I mean, the context of this is that Cambridge University, in the past few years, particularly since 2019, 2020, wanted to study more into its past links with enslavement. So particularly Atlantic slavery, people who owned enslaved people, who held shares in companies that trafficked enslaved people, held land in colonies and places that grew particular products. And this was an offshoot of that. So that was called the Legacies of Enslavement kind of inquiry that Cambridge ran. But a lot of individual colleges undertook their own explorations to try and figure out if they as sort of institutions had links. Because obviously, Cambridge is eternally bamboozled by the fact that it's half centralised university institution, half 31 colleges that are spread out and have their own histories, their own past, their own traditions. Yeah. So our college wanted to do that, and they were really, helpful and straightforward in setting up, basically letting students set up their own thing, their own inquiry, their own project to look into Christ's. And I had the pleasure of doing it with another student in the year below me at Christ's. And together we spent the summer of 2022, so last year's summer, the long vacation, I spent in Christ's, looking at archives, but most of it actually online, looking at online materials, and also building a website, which, as you say, we can always put in the bio for this. But yeah, it was a really, really big project to undertake, and it was a really, really fascinating exploration of how Christ had these past links to enslavement.
I'm going to play devil's advocate, and I want to make it very, very clear. This is not what I believe, but what would you respond to someone who goes, well, why does this matter? I'm not saying it doesn't matter.
Yeah,
of course, how would you respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big
and why does it affect us now?
I think, as a historian, David, I've got to handle this one. I think it explains to us, to all of us here now, who we are and who we were, and I think the value of studying the past for its own sake is immeasurable, because it can tell you a lot about human nature, but it can also tell you, obviously, about the present, about the institutions we see around us. So what we found at Christ's was that there were a lot of people who were the sons and nephews of people who'd owned enslaved people. So, basically the sons and nephews, the offspring, were often the ones who came. And we found this really fascinating sort of tendency whereby someone could go and make their fortune in Barbados, Antigua, Jamaica, have their son, whatever, born there, send them back for a gentleman's education in UK, in London and so on, in Cambridge, forgive me, and then sort of bring them back to plantations in the Caribbean. And I think that in particular struck me as a really instructive way of decoding the present as well, and how education can be a tool of legitimation and of cultivating oneself as a gentleman, even when wealth is derived from these really extractive or horrible industries.
And was there any surprising findings that you found personally interesting?
I mean, I have to be honest here. One of our big obstacles was that we were very good at finding people. We think we identified all the people who were either owned enslaved people or more often the offspring of people who owned enslaved people. But what we couldn't find was a smoking gun linking anything to college, the college itself, because Christ's had maybe it didn't have, we couldn't find its financial records for about 200 years of history. And, I've said this to people since. Some of them have gone, isn't it a cover-up? That's awfully convenient. But I, for what it's worth, having seen Christ College archives, having spent so much time there, it's more of an issue of how kind of archival silence can be created by clumsiness, by bad record keeping, by forgetfulness of people over centuries. So what was frustrating for us was we found a few instances where people had donated silver to college that was derived from enslavement money, but no instances that we could identify where money had been donated.
So say one of the findings you found was that these people are offsprings of people who have owned slaves.
Yeah.
How does that, or does that affect the way you treat them at all? And do you then try and educate them about their past, and what does that mean for them?
I thought it was such a vexing question, and a really big thing that I took away from this project was that these people, these children of people who owned slaves, were, they were so remarkably normal in every other way. They were people who led these unremarkable lives as vicars, sometimes as lawyers, who, often were born in the West Indies, could often be born in England, who would come to Cambridge, get this education, and go and live a perfectly normal rural life with a wife and with children, and die 50, 60, 70 years later. And what struck me was, what Hannah Arendt says about the banality of evil, that at once we were seeing the face, right, of evil in the British Empire, of racialised enslavement that had this really sort of mundane and banal output of these people who just lived normal lives, who could just as easily have known nothing about where their wealth came from as they could have been up to their necks in knowledge of what was happening in the West Indies, of what was happening in plantations. And I think the question that we wanted to give to our readers and that we wanted to make with the website that we built was, well, what do you think? Because we, as historians, we can only document, I think, and we could only give this evidence, we can only tell you what we thought and what we could find had happened in the past. But for judging these people, for saying, their wealth was derived from this source, their parents or their grandparents did this, we felt like we couldn't sit there, and it wasn't our place as historians to sit there and say, and that makes them bad, because, how could we possibly judge whether it makes them good or bad? I think it had to be for the reader to look at the evidence, the cold hard evidence, the 30,000 words of it that we presented, and say, what do I think of them? Who are these people? Could I be one of these people if I was born 200, 300 years earlier? Or do I sort of want to place myself apart from them? Do I think that they are morally reprehensible and it could never be me? I thought that was a really interesting moral question that we got to pose, of how do you judge these people who sort of weren't initiators, who didn't involve themselves in enslavement and yet benefited from it.
That's so fascinating. Such big questions, and I think Hannah Arendt's banality of evil, and also the concepts like politics out of history as well. Just incredibly fascinating how this continual narrative and implication that sometimes it's hidden, sometimes it's implicit, but it's nevertheless real and tangible when you explore into it. Out of just personal curiosity, I guess, how much was religion a part of this kind of project, understanding religious influences?
Well, a big way in which religion came up was in the discussions about the legitimacy and morality of slavery at the time. So there were people, there were figures on both sides who were fellows at Christ's, actually, a pair of them, who both try to kind of mobilize these arguments that religion either vindicated the practice of enslavement and vindicated, taking people from Africa, enslaving them and working them to death. And there were people as well who, as Wilberforce did, argued that there was a religious basis for putting an end to slavery. And I think what we really realised was that not that religion said slavery was wrong or right, because people at the time were making arguments on both sides, but rather that religion provided this framework, this legitimising framework in which both abolitionists both abolitionists and pro-slavery advocates wanted to use and mobilise and couch their arguments in. So I know that's an unhelpful response in some ways, but I guess the answer is it landed on both sides, and it was just a matter of who was using it and who was using it more persuasively.
Fascinating. Is there anything else about the enslavement project that you feel like is worthwhile and personally meaningful to you to capture in this recording?
I mean, I think just the experience of doing it was
clearly influenced you profoundly. I can really feel it.
I think it was just such an astonishing opportunity, and I think what I have to say, because it was a really big, I guess, facet of the project. It wasn't so much in a way it was a drawback, but also it was something that we knew going into the project, was that we couldn't access the voices, the lives, and the experiences of the people who were enslaved, and it was such a really difficult and in a way sort of upsetting experience as historians to approach it now and to say that we had to write a history of our college and enslavement. We had to write a history of our college and enslavement, and yet we couldn't get to the millions of people whose lives were ended and were destroyed by slavery, and instead we had to focus on the 38 people we concretely identified as being beneficiaries of enslavement in Cambridge, was a thing that we really did struggle with, because the stories that any historian wants to tell is the people whose voices weren't heard and whose voices have never been heard. But the remit of our project was to focus on these people who came here, who lived lives of relative extraordinary privilege, and who benefited from these practices.
Wow, such a meaningful endeavour. Well done to you for doing that.
Thank you.
I'm going to talk about something completely different.
Sure.
Christ-made bull.
Okay. I like the subject.
You were, I believe, head of staffing and security.
Yeah.
Would it be a very intense experience?
It was.
I was going to play at Christ-made bull in the Emma Jazz Band, but because of the train strike, I had to go to London, so I couldn't play.
Okay.
I've heard really good things, but go for it.
I was told universally that it was a very good event. I don't
universally.
Yeah, exactly. I got positive reviews from almost everyone. So it was. This was a really kind of intense experience for me, and in a way it linked kind of my personal development of me and what I prioritize and what I sort of care about, was that it was a really, really big job of organisation and administration. It was recruiting 120 staff from students, organising security, organising cleaning and so on, and all the first aid, all these different things, to make the bull on the night run like clockwork. And for the most part, I think we were up to the task. I had a really, really great team of people with me from Christ's who were helping to organise the staffing and security. But for me, what it really triggered in me was a desire to organise systems well, to administer things, to manage things in a way that was efficient and effective. Because before, and particularly with kind of the COVID years having just preceded that, I didn't really get a chance to manage something on a big scale, to talk to hundreds of people, and really kind of get engaged with students. And even though it was in a sort of hiring and so on, an organisational context, I think it really inspired in me a kind of a passion, I guess, for making things run smoothly and run better.
So choosing and managing 120 people.
Yeah.
Any best practices for any Mabel committees listening to this?
Well, David, in that case, I'll give you a list. Firstly, pay everyone properly, and what some bulls did, we were absolutely averse to, was half on, half off tickets, where a worker works half the night and then gets to go to the bull for the other half.
Oh, you don't agree with that?
We regarded that basically as you're farming free labour off people, right? And our view was these people are doing work, they're doing jobs, they should be paid. They shouldn't be paid sort of in kind, where you get their labour for free and then you get to let them sort of enjoy the ball for the last 5 hours.
Which doesn't really affect you, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. These people they were doing a job and they should be paid. So pay them and pay them properly. Don't try and do a thing which some employers do of paying certain people slightly less because it's legal to when they're under the age of 20 or 21. Pay everyone a good, standardised, proper wage. Which we did, and also we paid people above the national living wage. But then, of course, it was a 10 or 11 hour shift. Yeah. So it's I guess like the terms living wage are sort of mediated by that. Otherwise, and I'll say this with love, students don't answer their emails. We sent out 400 job offers over a couple of months. Not all at once, but gradually we were cycling through them. We got a 20,
it's
25.
Like, why did you apply and not accept this?
Yeah, David, it was frustrating for me. My boyfriend got very sick of me going on about, people not replying to our emails and people being slow and people sending me the wrong form with the wrong thing filled in. So I think for me, in some ways, it was almost a disenchanting experience for...
Yeah, these are Cambridge students.
Exactly. For realising that sometimes people, in this context, it's so busy and it's so hectic and we all have so many things on, it, for me, made me realise that a lot of Cambridge students... might not give you the time of day, and that was fine, I think, because I hadn't seen so much outside my college, my kind of smaller community of 400, 450 people. So it was reasonable, I think, for me to be a little bit woken up from my slightly sort of naive belief that everyone would be very organised, everyone would be replying to our emails, going, yes, of course, here's the form filled in. Yeah, there was a lot of people giving us their credit card numbers instead of their bank account numbers, which I could only put my head in my hands.
Hence, the 10.8% turnout for the SU election doesn't really surprise you?
Yes, yeah, as you say. So in the election, obviously, that I just, I won. Well, seems weird to say, but in that election, yeah, as you say, 10.8% turnout. But then, to sort of get into it, I guess my entire campaign was structured around the premise that, like, students don't engage with the students' union, the SU, precisely because it doesn't really do much that they feel directly affects them. It doesn't really do enough that they can point to and say, yes, who does that for me? So I guess that figure really was, it was kind of a great shame, right, that only 10.8% of people did vote and kind of bothered to vote. But also for me, it was in a peculiar way, it was kind of a vindication of what I'd been saying, that the warning lights are flashing red, and we have to really act in order to change how people perceive the students' union. Because turnout has dropped year on year on year, and it's doing that because students feel like the students' union doesn't really do enough for them or doesn't do very much. When I was out campaigning, I met so many people who, when I said, I'm running to be students' union president, would look at me and go, kind of, what's that? Oh, them. Well, what did they ever do for me? And by the end of the campaign, I was sort of asking myself that question: what does the students' union do for students? And obviously, it does a lot, but I guess a really big thing that I want to do is make it do more, but also make it visibly do more, because it does a lot of good work. It just isn't really seen by students sometimes.
So, indeed, the turnout has dropped year on year. It was 12% last year, 18% the year before. And when you won, two things that you said that kind of reinforce what you just said just then. Like you said, we're in a pit and we're going to get out of it. Change is coming. You also said the message for students is we hear you, we hear that you want change, and change is coming. What is interesting, I guess, is this we hear you, is that it's not an active, they raise something and you hear them, but it's more that they have completely almost abandoned, and the silence is actually the real message of...
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of putting it. I think what we heard was...
It's the silence, but that silence is so powerful.
That resounding silence, that when I went out, when I campaigned, when I handed out flyers, when I made sometimes serious, sometimes silly videos online... What I really encountered was that silence, was that, well, what does it do? Why is it there? And I think I became more radical in a way about that through the campaign, because I started out from this position of thinking, students vaguely understand it. They don't engage because they sort of disagree with some of its directions, they disagree with some things, or they just don't really think it affects their lives. But I guess by the end, and when I said, we hear you, change is coming, it was because so few people voted, and yet other people who did vote, a majority of them, as I say, very sort of self-esteemingly, voted and put their trust in me and in my promises and in my campaign. And I think that really, for me, that was testament to the fact that the people who were on, the people who were willing to still give us a chance to still cast a vote, saw what I was promising and saw that I recognise we need to change direction here, and we need to kind of snap out of this, because that, you know, and as you quoted, I said, you know, we're in a pit and we've got to get out of it. I mean, I actually ad-libbed that at the time because I didn't quite mean to say those words, but you know, afterwards I reflected and I thought back and I thought that's exactly where we are. We need to look up, look out, listen to students, and we need to change.
I guess before I ask some follow-up questions, just acknowledgement to Eve and other people who've run, because I think it takes a lot of guts to put yourself forward, and I think anyone putting themselves forward deserves some credit for that.
I've got to say, I mean, Eve was the other person who ran to be president. They ran a really, really fantastic, proactive campaign, and as just as testament to them, I've got to say, you know, when I was out campaigning, handing out flyers, handing out leaflets, you know, the whole shebang. Whenever I met someone who said, "Oh no, I've already voted," or "Oh no, I'm voting for Eve," they always said it with sort of impeccable politeness. But also a really big thing that always struck me was people were really engaged with how kind of I guess the principles and the values that Eve was really, really vocal about, and really kind of. Even people who said, "Oh, you know, I think I might vote for you," or "I'm on the fence," I think they always brought up was like, "I know that Eve has got their head screwed on right and have really got a really good commitment to making change." And I can only sort of praise that and esteem that, right? Because that's really, really impressive to see in anyone, let alone someone, as you say, who's willing to go through the quite exhausting process of running a campaign and getting so many votes as Eve did.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate you. I think it shows a lot of character, you know, growing up, you know, win with grace, lose with dignity, and participate with pride was a quote that we often got told.
Oh, that's very good.
I guess the SU role, like, you know, two days after you're elected, rightfully you're feeling on a high, the world is your oyster again.
Well, yes, sure.
But I guess very soon, or if not already, you probably feel the weight of the responsibility and the challenges that are going to come your way of being, you know, the face of this representative body for 24,000 students at Cambridge. That's just undergrads, I think. So what I was really fascinated by, and again, I think it's important now that you're elected that I do challenge you.
Yeah, please do.
In the Varsity article, it said that your election was not welcomed by everyone in the room. Many outgoing sabbatical officers did not clap. What do you make of that? Because that's not winning with grace, losing with dignity, and participating with pride. And also, why do you think that is the case?
Yeah, I mean, I personally understand it, and I don't wish to be unkind or indiscreet about what I say. What I would say is that the current serving president, Zainab, has done a really fantastic job all year, and actually personally encouraged me to run. Gave me really good kind of, sort of pastoral support and encouragement in the month leading up to this. And I'm so grateful to her for, even though I think we disagreed on some things, we agreed on a lot of things, but for even knowing that I didn't, you know, I wasn't in 100% agreement about things, really kept giving me kind of, encouragement, because she recognised that I care about this institution and I care about making the Students' Union better for students. So I say, for Zainab, you know, I can't praise enough just the warmth and the encouragement that I've had and that I've seen, because, you know, she's been a really, really fantastic leader for the union and for the cause that she cares about. You know, with regards to that comment that Varsity made, the editors in chief came up to me, you know, at the results party to say, you know, well done, and to take a comment and so on, and they said to me, "Oh, we noticed that some of the, as you say, current sabbatical officers didn't clap when you won." So it wasn't something which I said to them because I wasn't watching. But that, I think, you know, to speak about it in the most general terms, I think was a facet of one of my policies in particular, which was demanding tuition fee refunds. Because, I mean, particularly during the campaign and at hustings, which was in the middle of the campaign, I think I became increasingly vocal about this as a point that I felt, you know, I really sincerely believe in. And it's all a very complicated debate, but there are some people who are quite opposed to the idea that we should seek tuition fee refunds for when learning is disrupted by our lecturers being forced to take strike action. And I think it was probably, I can only speculate, but it was probably that sort of line of disagreement that I imagine meant some people didn't necessarily greet my our quite surprising win and scale of win in the most warm way. But that's politics. People disagree, and I respect every single person in that room with I have the utmost respect for them, and I think personally I think I get on with them all. I hope I get on with all of them well.
So in a year's time, when the next election happens, how would I and IS and me and also the general student body know that Fergus has truly delivered on what he has promised and that he's had a good term? Like, what are there any objective metrics that I can hold you to account this time next year?
I hope so. I guess I must preface this with, it's an organisation, not a person. I'm not being made autocrat of the SU. I'm being made one of its 11 or 12 trustees. I'm being made one of its 8 sabbatical officers. In a way, I don't wield so much power of the organisation that I can alone enact institutional change. It's going to be a team effort, and I look forward to working with the team to try and deliver that. In terms of what I guess as but as an external observer, I think a really important thing is to help resuscitate the reputation of the Students' Union in students' eyes, because too often the response when you mention the SU is, it's that, David. It's the kind of a laugh, it's the eye roll, it's the sort of shrug, and I think the more we can do to change that, to give people something where they at least sort of nod in acknowledgement that yes, it's a peculiar organisation, or yes, it's slow, and yes, it has its flaws, but it does something, I think will be a big change. Obviously, the other and the most obvious objective metric, right, is turnout in elections, is to ask if people really care and care enough to turn out. I think this will be a multi-year project, but certainly a hope that I have, even if it's not a metric I know I can deliver, a hope that I have is that turnout will be higher next year, and I will do everything in my power to make turnout higher next year in elections, if only by really trying to give people choice and give people a range of candidates. Because when you think about it, it was almost insane that Eve and I were the only 2 people running for this role. In a university of 30,000 students, there should have been loads of people coming out of the woodwork going, oh no, I fancy a chance to be SU president. So really, it's going to be a team effort. I want to, and I can't wait to work with the rest of the team to deliver, I guess, institutional change. But yeah, I guess that's just one metric, I suppose.
And I guess for your future self, I'm just going to read out the kind of pledges you put on your manifesto, and we will I will message you this time next year to see how you've been going. So firstly, you've got tackle health inequality, launch a scheme like you did at Christ and make NHS prescriptions free, pressure colleges to create a pooled fund for student dental care. Next action plan was more resources for uni society, and that meant overhaul the society's funding structure to make it more transparent and easier to navigate, create an SU bar and make room booking easier for societies. Next action plan, better bursaries and financial support, which includes campaign for the Cambridge bursary to rise with inflation. It's lost 18% of its value since being introduced. Extend the West Hub lunch subsidy across the uni. Next action point is welfare and workload reform, which includes campaign for colleges to standardise intermission and to guarantee offering counselling and accommodation to students intermitting. Make exam and teaching adjustments more accessible. Then the next action point is climate action, which means push colleges to expand on-site renewable energy, reducing energy costs and rents, hold the university to its divestment and net zero commitments. And final action point, the contentious one as you talk about, is demand tuition fee refunds, which means fight for tuition fees refunds for teaching disrupted by strikes. Best of luck as you undertake your term and delivering on your policies.
Thank you, David. Yeah, that's it's almost overwhelming to hear it run out, but yeah, I think
it's in the recording.
It's in the recording, so yeah, it'll be a team effort, and I look forward to giving it my best shot.
So we talked a bit about the ideological side of things. I want to now move on to more of the practical side. And you mentioned, in a university of this many students, it's a bit bizarre that only 2 people put themselves forward. Yeah. But I think part of the reason is people just don't understand how to run a campaign and how to go about it. And that is stopping, I think, is a barrier of entry. And a lot of very competent people, had they just got that little bit of confidence and insight and transparency, may consider putting themselves forward. So let's focus on the practical side of the campaigning for an SU presidency. You were handing out flyers, your face was everywhere. You had an Instagram account, you had videos, you had endorsements, you had different kind of collaborations. Walk me through the campaign infrastructure. When did you begin planning this?
Well, I began thinking about this, I began to consider running, I suppose, when I spoke to Zainab, the current president, about it. And Zainab actually, back in December last year, said to me, hey, have a think about this over the vacation. And I said, you know what, I will, because I've been involved a bit in the SU, not in leading it so much as sort of being part of it. And I was really touched by someone saying, think about this. I can see you care about students, and I can see you care about the institution. But for really planning this campaign and so on, that really just came within a couple of days, I suppose, of the thing beginning. I mean, I've been thinking for a while, what changes do I want to see? How would I want this university and this students' union to be different? And certainly I'd had discussions with my friends, thinking to myself, well, what's reasonable, what's plausible, what could I do, or what's worked when I try to do it in other contexts. But really, the campaign was maybe so exhausting and so, on and heavy, precisely because no one had really spent much time, planning it all out meticulously. There wasn't something where we'd gone and filmed all the videos in advance. Looking back at it, I wish we had, because it was a really exhausting thing to do in the middle of a campaign. But yeah, it was. That in itself, I guess, that answers the first bit of planning and thinking. Campaign itself, I can only thank the people who helped me. I had, a lot of my friends were really, really willing to pitch in. I was really touched by how much Christ's, my college, and the students there got behind me and really supported me. And I had, a really great network of people, mainly at Christ, but also lots of different colleges, helping me, supporting me, helping get my posters and pamphlets out flyers, I should say, to different colleges, different faculties and departments, helping me film videos, and giving me feedback, kind of telling me what, this policy doesn't really strike as much of a chord with students as that policy. It was really, I felt so incredibly supported by so many people, and that was a really, really kind of lovely and unexpected feeling.
And how did you go about getting all the endorsements from like major political societies or big communities?
So, I mean, I was endorsed by 3 JCR presidents, 2 leaders of SU, a leader of 2 SU campaigns, of which there are 7, I should say, and also by some chairs of political societies. And I think the main thing there was really, a lot of it was just going to people, talking about what they thought of the SU. And I guess this sounds so incredibly politician-y to say I shared my vision with them and I discussed with them how the SU could be better, and I found that they really agreed with me. But 3 JCR presidents thinking that out of a university of 31 colleges, I suppose, is not statistically unreasonable, right? But I think really, again, I was blown away and I was really touched by it, at how many people saw my policies, who met me and went, I support that. I believe you can deliver that, and B, that's something that I really want to see for this university. And everyone had different things. It wasn't like one thing caught up everyone. In each of the people who endorsed me, it was a different thing that they were really passionate about and confident, in my ability to seek or to deliver. And that in itself was astonishing, that so many people were willing to not just sort of put their faith in me in voting for me, because, plenty of students did that, but also, a majority did, I suppose, but to actually publicly say, this is what I want and this is what I believe in, because I've realised, in the past 2 weeks, that's such an empowering thing to be able to do,
What about your campaign during that process gave you nightmares?
Oh, gosh, that's a very good question. I suppose it was a really intense period, and I had a friend of mine was helping me film all the videos, was keeping me sane, was stopping me getting run over by buses and by bikes. And I guess my main fear was that either I or he would, guess, burn out or just hit our limit. And I think a couple of times I did hit my limit in terms of directly interacting with students, because as I've been saying, the SU doesn't have isn't sort of dramatically popular amongst students. And I think, as well, we're all busy, we're all living our lives, we're all studying our degrees, doing our extracurriculars. And there were some instances in which students were just, either like outright hostile or were just quite, unreceptive to you popping up and going, hey, I'm running a campaign, what do you think of these policies? I completely understood it. But by about the end of the campaign, I was getting really quite like emotionally and psychologically exhausted of repeatedly, I guess, sort of putting myself out there, of walking up to a stranger, introducing myself and going, this is what I think, this is what I believe in. Because obviously you can have students who say, oh no, I disagree, I want the other person's policy. And in a way that's reassuring, that's fine, that you know that there's a substantive disagreement going on. It was almost the people who look at you blankly and just sort of walk past. They didn't exactly give me nightmares, I suppose, but they certainly, it was that exhaustion that brought me closer to, I guess, burning out.
Very, I guess, character-shaping period, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I've been saying to people, it's the most fun I've had in years doing this.
I think when I ran my presidential campaign for the union and other campaigns, a speech that I continually went back to deal with all these kind of rejections and humiliations was Teddy Roosevelt's The Man in the Arena. Have you heard of that speech?
No, I haven't.
I'll just read it out to you. It gave me a lot of comfort and courage to put myself out there. So this is Teddy Roosevelt. It's called, I think, Citizenship in a Republic. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end of the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat.
Wow, that's really moving. Gosh, and I think that was, I guess, in an unconscious way, I think that summarizes what I felt over the past week of
striving,
of standing and saying,
fighting something you believe in, while recognizing that you won't be perfect, and that's okay.
That's moving. It really to stand up to say, this is what I believe in, and to know that you could fail, to know that you could not succeed, but to know that if nothing else, you have been honest to people, you've been honest to yourself, and you have striven to do, not just to talk or to criticize.
You definitely be being a man in the arena for the past few weeks, and I commend you on that. I guess the purpose of the podcast, as we said, is to give you a legacy-worthy interview, which I consider like a meaningful piece of recording that currently captures a snapshot of who you are, and also that you can listen back to in 10, 20 years' time with great fulfillment. You've done a lot, you've achieved a lot, and I understand that within an hour it's very difficult to capture every single thing, but is there anything else before I move on to maybe some rapid-fire questions and a couple final ones that you really want to be included in this recording?
I think, I can only reflect on, on the moving speech you just sort of recited there, because I think what I've learned here and what I've learned coming here, and as I said earlier, thinking this could be it, thinking I've had 18 good years and that's fine, but in the time since then, in my nearly 3 years now here, is that you can always strive to help people, you can always strive to be better yourself, you can strive to know more people and to meet more people, and that there is nothing quite as rewarding, as fulfilling, as being able to look back and say, not just, I did what was expected, or I did, what I thought I had to. But I suppose to look back and say, I did my absolute best, I tried my absolute hardest, and I strove to make a difference. And I suppose what past weeks and what this podcast as well has really given me cause to reflect is that I have striven, and I'm exceptionally pleased about that.
That's amazing, and it's almost a good ending to the podcast, but I'm not going to let you off the hook yet.
Absolutely.
Some rapid fire question just for people to get to know the new SU president a little more. Is your bed made at the moment? So rapid fire.
No, it is not.
Okay. What is your favourite board game?
Monopoly.
Who's your favourite Disney character?
Never watched Disney films.
If you weren't studying history at Cambridge, what's another subject or tripos you would be doing?
Maths.
Wow.
Yeah, I love maths, and I sometimes I wish I had done it. Sometimes.
Not counting campaign week, who do you text the most?
My boyfriend.
What's your favourite season?
Autumn.
Favourite fruit?
Peach.
What's the first thing you do when you wake up in the morning?
Check my phone. I think check my phone.
Are you voting Fergus?
Exactly. I check my phone. Deal with some campaigning work. No, I check my phone and probably have a shower.
What's one of the nicknames that you've had in high school?
Oh. I'm afraid Fergus. It's terribly boring. Some people try to call me Fergie. It never caught on, and I'm fine with that.
And final rapid fire question is, do you have a pet?
No, although my boyfriend has some very cute pets, so I indirectly have the pride of having a pet without any of the inconvenience.
Final two questions then. Second to last one. How have your fears over the years changed and evolved?
I think I was a very fearful person growing up. I was a very anxious person growing up. And I think with anxiety, it never really leaves one. I think, you can learn different ways to process it, but I think some people probably are biologically more inclined in their brain chemistry to be anxious and to be worried about things. I think my fears have probably become, have shifted. I think I've always been, I guess in recent years, I was more preoccupied with mortality, right? With mortality of people around me and myself. But I think doing what I've been doing has actually been a big way of combating my fears, because I think I always had a fear of standing out, of being too public, of being too, out there. I've always been quite like a private person, and I always wanted to sort of blend in with the crowd. And I think, you might say, well, then why did you put your face everywhere? Why did you want to be SU president? And in a way, I think it was to try and beat that fear. So I don't know if I have, but I certainly feel I feel more confident now. I feel less anxious walking around. So I suppose just one of my fears, I guess, that's changed is that anxiety and that fear of people seeing me as different.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. Just before I ask my final question, I got to add one more just for the sake of the final question. How have you found, say, the past hour of, taking on questions that you had no idea were coming, and that combine the public element and the private element? How have you found this experience so far? Yeah,
I mean, massively rewarding. I think it's a really good opportunity to sort of prompt reflection, to take a snapshot of what I'm thinking now. With facts about me and with sort of secrets and so on, I think I'm a very open person. I think I'm often too open a person in terms of I don't see that good ever come from secrets. So people often find when they talk to me that I'll tell them as much or as more sort of more than they necessarily wanted, necessarily sort of meant when they were going in and asking the question. So I think this has been really like a great opportunity to reflect for me, and also to I guess try and pull at the strings of some of the things that have been significant for me, that have been meaningful for me, and that have sort of been formative of my time here.
Okay, well, I guess that's a good kind of context of the final question, in that I think when you take on any sorts of public role, it's very easy for people to form an impression of you based on the public content and the image and forget about the real person. And, you know, something about this recording, which I hope is different to the kind of more public appearances, is that there's more of a space for you to elaborate your thoughts and to share your thinking process and to put things in context, such as, you know, we talked about the health inequalities, the things that you advocated, but it makes more sense of why you're motivated. And for example, you're motivated because of the health conditions that you have had and the experiences you've had during COVID with shielding. So in the next year, as you take on this role, there's going to be a lot of criticisms of you, and that's going to get quite personal. It's going to get quite unfair. There's going to be a lot of misconceptions about you. And it's all part of the job, and I know you're well aware of that, but maybe just to end the podcast, what are some questions that you think you would appreciate more people would ask you about to really understand and empathise with Fergus, the person, who then obviously becomes Fergus, the politician? But
what are some? That's an astonishing question. I think the question that one always has to ask is, what brought you here, and what does it mean to you? Because, and they sound vague. I think what brought you here, I always try with people to look behind why they're doing things, what are their motivations are, and I think particularly with politicians, with public figures, we get very good at vilifying them, of saying this person is doing this because they're bad, because they're evil, because they are wrong. And I think the more empathy, and this is why I'm such a fan of your podcast, but also just of you, of talking to you, David, when we're not being recorded as well, is because I think you have an extraordinary skill for empathy and of asking, well, what brought you here? Of not saying, you must be wrong because you disagree with me or because you're doing something that I think is bad, but asking, well, why are you doing it? Of assuming, take as a given that someone is trying their best, that someone is trying to act in good faith, and asking, what brought you here? And secondly, well, what does it mean to you? And I think you've been exceptional at really digging into that in this, is to ask, well, what did that experience mean? Because we have, I think, so little time here, but perhaps also in our lives, right? So little time to reflect, to think, well, what did doing that project mean to me? What does running for this role mean? What does that exhausting sort of week and a half of campaigning, of busyness mean to me? And I think if we ask ourselves those questions, and if, that's the question I suppose I wish people would ask me, and you have been asking me, is, oh, sure, you did this thing, you had this experience, but what does it mean? What have you taken from it? What did you learn? And I hope that the people always, for me, in my roles, but for everyone else, and as they go into their lives, ask, well, what brought that person to this point? And what they're doing, what does it mean to them?
Wow, how profound. I genuinely hope that as you embark on your role, that others will keep these two questions in mind, and that you will also ponder it as well, because I think it gives us a sense of direction to think about the purpose and meaning with which that motivates us and motivates our actions. And I guess, Fergus, it fills me with a lot of warmth and happiness to remember the first encounters that we've had in first year, both trying to figure out this place.
Yes.
And the chats we've had about your health conditions and COVID and IB and our aspirations, and to see that we've now made it almost the end of our undergraduate degree, and to see you do so well and to win this election, it makes me very happy, and I wish you genuinely all the very best.
Thank you, David. That means a lot to me.